During one of the most celebrated military interventions in Australian history, a senior New Zealand SAS officer formally warned his own soldiers not to copy the Australians. In a sworn statement that would remain classified for more than 2 decades, he described the approach of Australia's most elite Special Forces unit as that of Cowboys, operators who believed they were fighting a war when their mandate required something fundamentally different. The warning came after what witnesses from multiple nations described in sworn testimony as the execution of wounded men, the mutilation of their bodies, and the operation of an illegal detention facility in the heart of a mission Australia called its finest hour. The investigation that followed lasted 2.5 years, produced forensic exhumations and criminal charges, and ended with an acquittal, an apology to the accused, and court records that remain sealed to this day. When professional accountability conflicts with military brotherhood, which obligation wins, and who gets to decide? Leave your answer in the comments before you watch, and see whether this history changes it. Because what you are about to discover suggests the question does not have a simple answer, and that getting it wrong has consequences that reach much further than anyone acknowledged at the time. To understand what happened on a road outside the town of Swai on the 6th of October, 1999, it is necessary to understand what had been happening on that island for 24 years. Indonesia's invasion of East Timor in December of 1975 annexed a territory the United Nations had never recognized as Indonesian and installed an occupation that killed approximately 180,000 people, roughly 1/3 of the pre-invasion population, through direct violence, deliberate famine, and disease across nearly a quarter-century of suppression. The occupation was systematic and sustained. Villages were destroyed, populations displaced, resistance movements tracked and dismantled by Indonesian military intelligence, with a methodical patience that precluded any rapid international response. The world largely looked elsewhere. The mechanics of that suppression deserve more than summary. Indonesian military strategy in East Timor was not simply brutal. It was comprehensive in a way that distinguished it from the improvised violence of less organized occupations. The resettlement program moved entire communities from their traditional lands into controlled villages where population monitoring was straightforward and agricultural self-sufficiency was deliberately undermined. The famine that followed the 1975 to 1979 period of intensive military operations killed tens of thousands who had survived the initial invasion. It was not incidental to the strategy. It was, in the assessment of those who study the occupation most closely, a predictable consequence of displacement policies that the military made no serious effort to prevent and some effort to accelerate. International journalists were barred from the territory for the occupation's first years. The Red Cross was restricted. What information escaped came through Catholic Church networks and the accounts of the small number of journalists who entered clandestinely, at considerable personal risk. The result was that the scale of what was occurring took years to register internationally, and by the time it did, the patterns of suppression were deeply entrenched, and the population had been reduced by violence and deprivation to a fraction of what it had been. What the occupation produced over 24 years was a population that had learned to survive through concealment, through network loyalty, and through the patient accumulation of grievances that could not yet be expressed openly. The Catholic Church became the primary institutional framework through which East Timorese identity was preserved and passed between generations, not because the Church was politically radical, but because it was the one institution the Indonesian administration found difficult to suppress entirely without creating the kind of international attention it preferred to avoid. The resistance movement, Brereton, maintained guerrilla operations in the mountainous interior throughout the occupation, never defeated, never able to win, sustaining a symbolic presence that the population understood as evidence that the occupation had not achieved the permanence it claimed. When the referendum opportunity came, the vote was not simply a political choice. It was the first moment in nearly a quarter century that the population could state publicly and collectively what it had always known privately. 98% voted for independence. That figure was not an anomaly or a statistical artifact. It was the authentic expression of a population that had endured systematic violence for an entire generation and had never accepted the legitimacy of the force that imposed it. What changed the equation was not international pressure, but the domestic collapse of the Indonesian regime that had made the occupation possible. The fall of President Suharto in 1998 placed his successor, President B.J. Habibie, in a position of political vulnerability, and Habibie made a decision that surprised even his own military establishment. He agreed to allow a referendum on East Timorese independence. The offer was not made from idealism. It reflected Habibie's reading of Indonesia's international position and the cost of maintaining an occupation that the post-Suharto government could not defend without the authoritarian machinery that had sustained it. The military's reaction to the announcement was a warning in itself. Senior Indonesian commanders made clear, publicly and privately, that a vote for independence would produce consequences. The United Nations mission in East Timor, deployed to organize and oversee the referendum, documented the systematic arming of militia groups in the months before the vote, a preparatory violence that the international community observed, recorded, and failed to prevent. On the 30th of August, 1999, the people of East Timor voted. 98% chose independence. Indonesian military commanders had warned explicitly that such a result would produce consequences. They delivered on that warning within hours of its announcement. What followed the 4th of September, when the result was formally declared, constituted one of the most rapid episodes of organized destruction in the post-Cold War period. Indonesian military elements and the militia forces they directed and equipped moved through the territory burning, killing, and displacing with a coordination that distinguished systematic atrocity from spontaneous violence. Between 1,000 and 2,000 civilians were killed. 500,000 people were driven from their homes and forced into refugee camps across the border in West Timor. 80% of Dili's physical infrastructure was destroyed. The United Nations compound in Dili, where thousands of civilians had taken shelter believing its international status would protect them, was surrounded by militia, who made clear they were willing to test that assumption. The international staff inside faced choices about whether to stay or abandon those sheltering with them. Choices that added another layer to the moral complexity of an episode that had no layer to spare. In the southwestern district of Kovalima, in a coastal town called Swai, the violence reached a particular intensity. On the 6th of September, 1999, exactly 1 month before the ambush that would later shatter the ANZAC Special Forces relationship, members of the Laksar militia, operating with Indonesian military coordination, surrounded the Ave Maria Church. Inside were hundreds of civilians who had taken shelter there, believing the church's walls would protect them. They did not. Militia members moved through the compound, killing as they went, joined by Indonesian military personnel, while survivors who attempted to flee were cut down outside. The death toll has been estimated at between 200 and 345 people, including 3 Catholic priests whose bodies were found among the dead. The month became known in the territory's history as Black September. 5 Indonesian officials were subsequently tried in Indonesian courts for their role in the massacre. All 5 were acquitted. None spent a day in prison. It was the United Nations Security Council's Resolution 1264, passed on the 15th of September, 1999, that finally authorized an international response commensurate with the scale of what had occurred. The resolution authorized a multinational force to restore order, protect the population, and support the transition to independence. The mandate was specific and consequential. This was not a passive peacekeeping operation. The force was authorized to use whatever force the situation required. What the resolution could not specify was what kind of professional culture would execute that mandate, or what happened when the culture of the forces assigned to the mission had been calibrated for something other than the careful legal and political constraints that transitional peace operations demanded. From the 20th of September, 1999, the International Force East Timor, known universally by its abbreviation Interfet, began landing in Dili. 22 nations contributed to what would eventually become an 11,500-strong force. Australia provided the largest contingent, 5,500 personnel, the country's most substantial military deployment since the Vietnam War, reflecting both Australia's regional interests and its assumption of primary operational responsibility. New Zealand contributed approximately 1,200 troops, its largest deployment since the Korean War. The force's composition was multinational, its command was Australian, and its operational philosophy was shaped by the man who led it. Major General Peter Cosgrove was born in Sydney in 1947 and graduated from the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1968. He went to Vietnam with the 9th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and returned with a Military Cross earned in 1971, an award that established, early and concretely, the combat credibility his subsequent career would build upon. He commanded at battalion and brigade level through the 1980s and 90s, developing a reputation as an officer who combined operational competence with the communication skills that senior military leadership increasingly required in a media environment that scrutinized military operations with a directness earlier generations had not encountered. By 1997, he was the commandant of Duntroon itself, and his promotion to Major General in 1999 placed him in command of Interfet. At the moment, Australia needed a general who could manage both a complex operational environment and an intensely interested domestic audience. Cosgrove understood the second requirement as well as the first. He wore a slouch hat in every public appearance. He spoke to the Australian media with the reassuring directness of a man who had earned the right to project confidence. He became, during the East Timor mission, the most recognizable military figure Australia had produced in a generation. That recognition would carry him to Australian of the Year in 2001, Chief of Army in 2000, Chief of the Defence Force in 2002, and ultimately the Governor-Generalship in 2014. The question of what he knew about the events of the 6th of October, and when he knew it, would remain unresolved across the entirety of that ascent. At the tip of Interfet's operational capability was RES-4, the Response Force, a combined special operations element comprising 3 squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment, approximately 40 New Zealand SAS operators under Major Peter Kelly, and a contingent from the British Special Boat Service. These were the forces that arrived first, pushed deepest into contested territory, and operated in the areas where the distinction between restoring order and fighting a counterinsurgency was most acutely uncertain. The SASR brought to that environment an institutional identity forged across 5 years of Vietnam service, between 1966 and 1971, an identity built on a kill ratio that old soldiers described at 30-1, on operations so effective that Indonesian-backed guerrillas in Puak Tui province called the regiment Marung, the ghosts of the jungle. That record was the professional crown jewel of the regiment, the foundation of its self-understanding, the frame through which its operators understood what they were and what they did. They brought that self-understanding to East Timor intact. The New Zealand SAS brought a different institutional formation to the same operational space. The NZ SAS had also served in Vietnam and maintained its own demanding professional standards across subsequent decades, but its regimental culture had not calcified around a single defining combat period in the way the SASR's had. The approximately 40 operators Major Peter Kelly commanded were professionals trained in the same fundamental disciplines: selection, patrol work, close target reconnaissance, direct action, but who had not absorbed the specific Vietnam-derived warrior identity that the SASR carried as its deepest institutional inheritance. The two forces had worked together before, trained together, and shared the ANZAC bond that ran through every joint operation both nations had conducted since 1915. What distinguished them in East Timor was not capability or courage. It was the relationship between professional culture and operational context, specifically whether the culture each force brought to the mission was suited to what the mission actually required. The British SBS element completed the RESPFOR composition, bringing a third professional culture into the combined force. The significance of these different formations would only become apparent when all three sets of soldiers found themselves observing the same events and drawing different conclusions about what those events meant and what obligations they produced. The southwestern district of Kovalima presented Interfet with a specific set of challenges that concentrated within a single area everything the mission had been sent to resolve. SWI sat approximately 40 kilometers from the border with West Timor, close enough that militia forces displaced from the town could withdraw across the border, regroup under Indonesian military patronage, and re-infiltrate with relative ease. The geography meant the district could not be cleared once and considered stable. It required sustained presence and ongoing surveillance. And it required operations in a community that was processing a trauma of extraordinary scale. The Ave Maria Church stood in the town when RESP-4 arrived. The people who came out to watch the soldiers were survivors of what had happened there 30 days earlier. The bodies had been removed, but the compound remained, and anyone conducting operations in SWI did so in the shadow of a massacre that the international community had watched happen without preventing. Whatever these soldiers thought they were there to do, the population they were there to protect understood protection through the lens of what it had looked like when protection had not come. That context did not simplify operations. It made the standard of conduct those operations demanded more exacting, not less. Because in a community that had survived what SWI had survived, every action by armed foreigners was being measured against a threshold of violence that the survivors carried in their bodies. The distinction between a force that had come to restore order and a force that had come to impose it was not theoretical for those watching from the doorways of a town that still bore the marks of what had happened in the church compound a month before. Major General Cosgrove's decision to deploy RESPFOR to SWI reflected the operational logic of the oil spot concept. He had employed across the territory, secure key nodes, radiate control outward, move by helicopter to stay ahead of militia activity. RESPFOR's clearing operation in the Kovalima district produced results. A large group of suspected militia was detained and brought to a sorting process in which Timorese resistance force members helped identify the most hardened elements. Those individuals were flown by helicopter to Dili for more intensive questioning. The remainder, approximately 100 people, would be escorted by convoy toward the West Timor border. Their removal from the district intended to reduce the immediate threat level. The SASR took responsibility for the escort. What struck New Zealand SAS Soldier T as he watched the convoy load up was not the people, but what else was being loaded with them. Large quantities of furniture and other property, looted from Timorese homes during the post-referendum violence, were placed onto the vehicles alongside the detainees. Soldier T would later describe his reaction plainly. The New Zealanders were shocked that the suspects were being permitted to leave with stolen property. It was a detail that would have registered differently in a conventional counterinsurgency. In a peacemaking operation deployed explicitly to restore the rights and property of a population that had been systematically looted and displaced, it carried a specific weight. The rules governing conduct existed precisely to distinguish Interfet from the forces it had replaced. Permitting looted property to depart with those suspected of the looting dissolved that distinction in a way that was small, observable, and symptomatic of something larger. New Zealand SAS Soldier B, who had led the push into Swai, watched the convoy prepare to depart and offered the Australian officer in charge a straightforward question. "Do you need support for the escort?" The offer was declined. The convoy headed out toward the border at just before 5:20 in the afternoon of the 6th of October, 1999, according to Soldier L's subsequent account. Approximately 15 minutes later, the radio came to life. At just past 5 o'clock in the afternoon, approximately 4 kilometers west of Swai on the road toward West Timor, the convoy came under fire from the side of the road. The ambush was effective. 2 SASR soldiers were hit, one in the leg and arm, the other in the neck. These were the first serious Australian combat casualties since the Vietnam War, a fact that carried a weight in that moment, exceeding its tactical significance. 28 years had passed since Australian Special Forces had last taken serious fire in a combat engagement. The operators present understood, with the clarity that contact always provides, that the abstract possibility had become a concrete reality. The SASR returned fire. 2 militia were killed. The same Australian officer who had declined the New Zealand offer of support now requested it urgently. Light armored vehicles carrying NZ SAS personnel moved toward the ambush site, SASR operators riding atop the vehicles as they rolled. A Unimog carrying British SBS personnel responded in parallel. Soldier T was inside the LAV, unable to see out, hearing what he described as sustained gunfire as the vehicle moved toward the contact. The LAV stopped. The ramp dropped. New Zealand soldiers ran out and took up defensive positions. The firefight was over. 2 militia were dead. 2 Australian soldiers had been wounded and evacuated. The immediate tactical crisis had passed. What followed in the next several minutes was observed by soldiers from multiple nations and recorded in sworn statements that would not become public for more than 20 years. Soldier U, positioned approximately 10 to 15 meters away, heard a number of shots after arriving, 2 or 3 separate reports, each distinct enough to cause him to take cover again. He heard someone call out in words to the effect that they were our rounds, just shooting the bodies. The phrase, delivered casually as it was reported, described an act whose implications were unambiguous to anyone trained in what armed conflict legally permits and what it does not. A firefight ends when the threat ends. Men on the ground who are wounded and no longer fighting do not remain legal targets. Soldier S subsequently described a conversation with an SASR operator who told him one militia had not been dead, who had got up and attempted to run, at which point the operator identified as Operator K had shot him. If accurate, that account described the killing of a wounded, unarmed man attempting to flee a battlefield. Under the legal framework the Interfet Mandate incorporated, that constituted a war crime. Soldier X would later tell military investigators that Operator K had put additional rounds into bodies that were already dead. Between Soldier U, Soldier S, and Soldier X, the picture that emerged across three independent accounts was consistent and its implications were severe. The situation remained operationally chaotic in the minutes that followed. As the groups reassembled at the vehicles, further shots were fired from the surrounding area. Soldier M saw rounds strike the ground meters away, and the resultant counter-ambush drills briefly scattered the assembled force. The evening light was fading. In those circumstances, contact recently ended. Wounded evacuated, a secondary threat still possible, the decisions made about how to handle the bodies and how to manage the force's withdrawal would carry consequences extending well beyond the immediate tactical situation. In the fading light, the two dead militia were dragged toward the SASR vehicles and hoisted onto the rear of the LAV above the door for the return journey to Swai. Soldier U, on the way back, asked a British SBS soldier whether what they had just witnessed was the way things were done, whether this was how they cleared the area. The SBS soldier's response was itself a question. Was this the way the New Zealanders operated? Both men understood what the exchange meant. Neither needed to say it plainly. The journey back to Suai lasted minutes. What occurred on the back of the light-armored vehicle during that journey, and in the moments after it arrived, would be described in sworn statements by NZ SAS operators, Australian intelligence staff, and a British SBS soldier whose presence at the scene placed the events beyond any possibility of single-nation denial. Multiple independent witnesses, observing from different positions, whose accounts converged on the same sequence of events with a consistency that military police investigators would later describe as establishing credibility beyond reasonable doubt. Soldier U observed Operator K standing toward the rear of the LAV. He heard Operator K screaming, "How dare you shoot my boys?" or words to that effect, and watched him kick and punch the bodies on the vehicle. Then Operator K kicked one body off the back of the LAV. Soldier U's recorded reaction, rendered in the plain vernacular of a soldier processing what he had just seen, was unambiguous. I thought to myself, fuck, he has lost it. Soldier T witnessed the same scene from a nearby position. Operator K was shouting, "That's for hurting my lads," kicking the bodies, and kicked one off the vehicle. Soldier T then helped lift the second body down. His recorded statement was brief. I was shocked. Soldier P heard Operator K's distinctive voice saying, "Got you, you fuckers," and observed approximately 2 persons near a body on the ground, while another kicked it. 3 separate accounts from 3 separate observers, none in communication with the others at the moment of observation, describing the same actions and the same actor. The convergence of that testimony across national lines was not something investigators could easily dismiss, and none of those who subsequently worked the case attempted to. What Soldier T also observed, and later committed to testimony, carried its own forensic weight. Both bodies had been shot through the throat in what he described as near impossible similar positions, wounds inconsistent with the random geometry of firefight casualties and more consistent with deliberate close-range shooting. A soldier trained in what combat wounds look like, seeing two bodies with matching wounds in an unlikely location, was not making a legal conclusion. He was making an observation. The observation would eventually find corroboration in what pathologists discovered when they examined those same bodies 3 years later. The concerning conduct did not end at the LAV. Operator K reportedly directed personnel to shoot anything moving outside the camp perimeter, specifically including all dogs in the area. British SBS soldier AC told military investigators this alarmed him directly. RESPFOR had clearing patrols operating in exactly that zone, and an instruction to fire at anything moving was not a sound operational order. It was a danger to those patrols. An Australian SAS officer overruled Operator K. That overruling was significant, not only because it prevented the immediate hazard, but because it established, in the recollections of those present, that Operator K's conduct had been recognized as unacceptable by at least one Australian superior within hours of the ambush. The internal recognition existed. What institutional obligation that recognition created, and whether it was fulfilled, is one the official record has not answered. When NZ SAS soldiers returned to Suai following the evening's events, they found the SASR had already completed their debrief and were departing. Soldiers U and T gave identical accounts of finding the Australians unwilling to include them in the after-action process. Both had been in the contact. Both had witnessed what followed it. Both believed, as a matter of operational procedure and professional obligation, that they should have participated in the debrief. Their exclusion was not explained to them at the time. Military police investigator Carl Fahlauer, who would spend years working the subsequent inquiry, later drew an explicit conclusion about that exclusion. The NZ SAS soldiers were kept out precisely because including them would have produced witness accounts of what they had observed, accounts that would have contradicted whatever version of events was being committed to the official record. ANZAC operator, who subsequently read the Australian SAS operational report on the Suai ambush, noted that it contained a number of discrepancies when measured against what those soldiers had witnessed directly. The report and the testimony described the same event differently. Only one of them was sworn. On the morning of the 7th of October, 1999, New Zealand legal officer Captain Andrina Gill sat at her desk in Interfet headquarters in Dili and opened her diary. What she wrote that morning described a command decision that would shape everything that followed. Gill's position in the Interfet structure was specific, and its independence mattered. She was a New Zealand officer, not an Australian one, which meant she had no institutional stake in protecting the SASR's record. But she was also embedded in Interfet headquarters, which meant she had a direct stake in the mission's success and reputation. She was not a hostile observer seeking evidence of misconduct. She was a military legal officer whose professional responsibility was to ensure that the force she served with operated within the framework its mandate required, the same framework that distinguished Interfet's mission from the violence it had been deployed to stop. When she heard what NZ SAS soldiers were describing from the previous evening, she requested an investigation. The 6th of October had been the first fatal shooting of the Interfet mission. Establishing proper legal procedures for investigating lethal force was not a bureaucratic preference. It was a legal obligation the mission's mandate explicitly required her to uphold. an investigation would have been in her professional assessment, the unremarkable institutional response to an incident of that nature. What she received instead was the opposite. Major General Cosgrove came in and announced he would not authorize one. Gill's diary entry that morning recorded her assessment with a clarity that required no embellishment. My view is it could bite. It could be seen as a cover-up. She was not writing for publication. She was not staging a protest. She was a professional making a private record of a professional concern, in the manner that professionals in positions of legal accountability are trained to do. She wrote what she thought, filed it in a diary, and continued to do her job. The diary entry would remain private for 22 years. When it finally became public, in April of 2022, it described in 4 lines what 2 decades of official silence had not resolved. 22 years later, Major General Cosgrove, by then Sir Peter Cosgrove, former Chief of Army, former Chief of the Defence Force, and former Governor-General of Australia, told the ABC Four Corners program that he had been unaware of any alleged impropriety at the time of the 7th of October. Had he known, he said, he would have immediately ordered an investigation. The gap between that account and what Andrina Gill recorded in her diary on the morning of the day in question is one of the unresolved factual tensions at the center of this story. It is presented here as the record presents it. 2 accounts, both on the record, describing the same morning differently. The gap between them has not been officially resolved. What occurred in Dili on the same day as the ambush introduced a second set of events that would prove equally resistant to formal resolution. 14 Timorese boys and men were detained on suspicion of militia involvement and taken not to the official Interfet detention center, but to a heliport facility controlled by the Australian SAS, an unofficial site that served as an interrogation holding area outside the formal command structure's oversight. At least 10 of the 14 were brought to this facility. The group's ages ranged widely. At least one was 16 years old. Another was estimated to be approximately 13. They were shown the bodies of the 2 militia killed in the ambush. 2 of the detained men had gunshot wounds and had been receiving emergency medical treatment before they were removed from the medical facility and brought to the SAS site instead. Days later, one man's wound was described by those who saw it as seeping and infested. The conditions of detention, unofficial, unregistered, involving children and wounded men, producing medical deterioration that would have been prevented by the treatment those men had been receiving before their removal, fell outside the legal framework Interfet's mandate required by any honest assessment. The Allied reaction to this facility was consistent across national lines. A British officer instructed his personnel to have nothing to do with it. A New Zealand military legal officer advised that what was occurring at the site might legally obligate New Zealand troops to refuse to transfer any detainees to Interfet custody at all, a remarkable position for an officer embedded in Interfet headquarters, one that reflected the gravity of what New Zealand's legal staff believed was occurring there. A subsequent military police inquiry reportedly assembled briefs of evidence for charges of torture against 3 intelligence officer commanders connected to the site's operation. No charges were ever filed. The Australian Defence Department has declined to this day to explain why. The 3 commanders involved have never been publicly identified. The interrogation facility they ran has never been officially acknowledged. The boys and men detained within it have never received any public accounting of what happened to them there. The silence around the black site is in some respects more complete than the silence around the ambush. The ambush at least produced a formal investigation, a criminal charge, a trial, and a public acquittal. The events at the heliport facility produced an investigation that reportedly reached the point of assembling prosecution briefs and then stopped without a charge, without an explanation, without a public outcome of any kind. The Australian Federal Police investigation into the ambush killings and the military police inquiry into the broader East Timor allegations ran in parallel across the same years, and the torture allegations were among the most serious matters either inquiry examined. That the murder allegations produced a charge and the torture allegations produced nothing is a disproportion that the official record has never explained. The men who assembled the torture briefs and then filed them without action have not spoken publicly. The commanders against whom those briefs were assembled have not been named. In the architecture of institutional silence that surrounds the East Timor episode, the Black Site and its aftermath represent the most complete and the least addressed chapter. Andrina Gill was speaking informally with NZ SAS soldiers in the days after the ambush, and they confided what they had seen and heard. Their accounts were consistent, their distress visible. She believed them. "I don't think they're making it up," she told Four Corners when the program broadcast its investigation in April of 2022. The informal conversations continued. They remained informal because there was no authorized formal investigation to receive them. Without that channel, what soldiers were saying to each other began moving through the only mechanism available: memory, conscience, and time. Within weeks of the ambush, the events of the 6th of October had produced a formal document whose language would become the most cited description of what had gone wrong in the SASR's approach to the East Timor mission. The New Zealand SAS officer identified in subsequent legal proceedings only as Soldier X, a senior commander whose institutional standing gave his assessment a weight that informal complaint would not have carried. Provided investigators with a sworn statement that characterized the problem with a precision that has not since been improved upon. "I became concerned with the attitude of the SASR," Soldier X wrote, "and there seemed to be a general perception that this was a shooting war like Vietnam, and not a peacekeeping mission. I would describe their attitude as being cowboys. As a result, I told my soldiers that East Timor was a peacekeeping mission, not a war, to ensure that at no time could we, the NZ contingent, be tarred with the same brush, cowboys." The Vietnam comparison was not incidental. It was analytically precise. The SASR's Vietnam record was the institutional foundation of the regiment's professional identity. 5 years of counterinsurgency operations, the Ma Rung reputation, a kill ratio that defined what Australian Special Forces believed they were capable of. To characterize the East Timor attitude as like Vietnam was to identify the specific professional self-image that Soldier X believed was being misapplied. A warrior culture calibrated for sustained counterinsurgency combat had been brought to an environment that demanded the opposite of what that culture had rewarded. The professional excellence and the professional problem were, in Soldier X's assessment, inseparable. The same formation that had produced the Ma Rung record had brought to SWI a set of operational instincts that the mission's mandate did not sanction and the conduct of war did not permit. Yet the statement was not simply a characterization of culture. What made it more than that was the record of what Soldier X had done before writing it. He had not simply observed and recorded. He had raised his concerns with the British SBS officer attached to RESPFOR. He had raised them directly with the Australian SAS operations officer, using the internal chain of command as it was designed to be used, and had made a specific recommendation. Remove Operator K from frontline operations and reassign him to a role in Dili, away from the operational environments where his conduct posed the greatest risk. Nothing was done. No record has been made public of the Australian SAS operations officer acting on the recommendation or escalating it upward. The Soldier X statement, when it eventually became part of the formal investigative record, documented not only what had happened on the 6th of October, but the institutional failure to act on warnings delivered through proper channels before the investigation had even begun. The problem had been identified, reported, and ignored. The sequence of that failure matters as much as the events of the ambush itself, because it establishes that the conduct of the 6th of October was not a surprise to everyone who might have been in a position to prevent it. What that sequence also documents is the specific mechanism by which institutions absorb warning signals without producing change. Soldier X used the correct channels. He spoke to the correct people. He made a specific, actionable recommendation. The recommendation was not rejected. There is no record of its rejection, or of any formal response at all. It was absorbed into the institutional structure and produced no observable effect. The failure was not a failure of detection or reporting. It was a failure of response. And it is that specific failure, not the ambush, not the witness testimony, not the prosecution collapse, but the failure to act on a warning that arrived before any of those things, that most clearly illustrates what institutional accountability requires and what happened in East Timor when it was not provided. The investigation that Andrina Gill had sought on the morning of the 7th of October would eventually come, but not through any authorization from the Interfet commander. By approximately 2,000, NZ SAS soldiers had begun moving beyond informal conversations. The accounts they had been carrying, the shots after the firefight, the bodies on the LAV, the kicking and punching and the shouted phrases, the debrief they had been excluded from, began producing sworn testimony to the Royal Australian Corps of Military Police. A secret special inquiry was initiated, examining 19 separate allegations of wrongdoing connected to East Timor operations. The Suai ambush killings were the most serious among them. By 2001, the military police had brought in the Australian Federal Police to advise on the investigation's most consequential dimension. The AFP's internal assessment was unambiguous. It was prudent to run a murder investigation. The evidence before the investigators suggested both militia killed on the road west of Suai might have been shot at close range with a 9mm pistol after being wounded, a pattern inconsistent with deaths sustained in an active firefight and consistent with the execution of men who could no longer pose a threat. The AFP noted one further consideration in its internal report, with a candor that illuminated the environment in which the investigation was operating. The political impact of this investigation has been assessed as substantial and has to be managed. The investigation was prudent. The political impact was substantial. Both were simultaneously true, and the tension between them persisted through every subsequent decision the investigation produced. In October of 2002, 3 years after the ambush, the bodies of the 2 militia killed on the road west of Suai were exhumed. A forensic pathologist performed autopsies. The findings were significant. One man appeared to have been shot in the back of the head. Both corpses showed shattered skulls and broken ribs, injuries consistent with a precision the investigators found notable, with the kicking and punching that multiple witnesses had described in sworn testimony. Australian military intelligence staff, who had seen the bodies in Dili within hours of the killings, recalled a specific detail. At least one man had been shot in the head at close range, characterized by singed hair around a neat entry point. The forensic findings did not contradict the witness accounts. They corroborated them, and they corroborated the specific observation Soldier T had made in the immediate aftermath about the nature and similarity of the wounds he had observed on the two bodies. The question before investigators was whether the available evidence could sustain a murder prosecution. The answer was that it could not, at least not with the certainty a criminal charge required. What the evidence could sustain was a charge of mistreating corpses. In 2003, Operator K was charged accordingly. The charge was lesser than what the AFP had considered investigating, but it was what the evidence, carefully assessed against the standard of proof a military court would apply, could actually support in a prosecution that would need to survive defense scrutiny. At least 2 NZ SAS soldiers had indicated their willingness to testify. They were the only eyewitnesses the prosecution had. Their testimony was not supplementary to the case. It was the case. Without them, the physical evidence and the investigative conclusions existed, but floated without the witness foundation that a criminal prosecution requires to close the gap between allegation and proof. The New Zealand Defence Force sought to protect its soldiers accordingly, requesting that witnesses be identified by call signs rather than their real names, citing genuine concerns about the safety of its personnel if their identities became known within the SASR community. This was not an unusual accommodation in Australian military legal proceedings. In the defamation trial involving Victoria Cross recipient Ben Roberts-Smith, Australian SAS witnesses had been granted precisely that kind of identity protection. The precedent existed. The application was reasonable. Military magistrate David Gunson ruled against it. Fairness to the accused required real names. The NZDF stated plainly that it could not guarantee the safety of its soldiers under those conditions. The witnesses did not take the stand. Without them, the case dissolved. Operator K was acquitted. The investigation that the AFP had described as prudent, that had consumed 2.5 years, and the testimony of soldiers from 3 allied nations, produced an acquittal and an institutional apology to the man it had targeted. What it had not produced was a conviction, an accounting, or any official version of what had occurred on the road outside Suai on the 6th of October, 1999. The specific mechanism of the collapse deserves careful attention because it has been obscured in public discussion of the case by the tendency to describe it simply as a failure of evidence. The evidence was not weak. The forensic findings were consistent with the witness accounts. The witness accounts were consistent with each other, across soldiers from 3 nations who had observed the same events from different positions and given their accounts independently. What failed was not the evidentiary foundation of the case, but the procedural framework within which the only eyewitnesses could be brought to court. Magistrate Gunson's ruling was not capricious. It reflected a genuine principle about the rights of an accused to know the identity of those testifying against him. But the ruling operated within a system in which the protection of Allied witnesses in Australian military proceedings had no established framework, and the absence of that framework produced an outcome that protected the accused more thoroughly than the law, as a matter of principle, was required to do. The NZDF's request had been consistent with accommodations the ADF had made in other proceedings. The refusal to extend the same accommodation here was legally defensible and operationally catastrophic for the prosecution. Karl Fehlauer, the military police sergeant who had served as principal investigator in the special inquiry, made his first public statement about the proceedings in 2022. His assessment of the New Zealand witnesses was unambiguous. They were, in his professional judgment, extremely credible, visibly distressed when recounting what they had seen, consistent across their accounts, and, in his assessment, truthful. The case had not collapsed because the witnesses were unconvincing. It had collapsed because a procedural ruling had made it legally impossible to call them. The distinction between those two outcomes, between witnesses who could not be believed and witnesses who could not be called, is not a distinction the acquittal preserves in the official record. What the official record preserves is the result. The reasons for that result, and what they mean about the reliability of the result itself, are questions the sealed court records do not answer. The legal proceedings had ended. The consequences had not. The relationship between two special forces units that had fought as ANZAC brothers in every major conflict since Gallipoli had been altered in ways that no institutional statement could conceal from the soldiers who had been present in East Timor. The 2000 Sydney Olympics provided the first shared operational environment after the mission, the two forces working together in a joint security operation for the Games. The tension was described by those present as palpable. One NZ SAS soldier told investigative journalist David Fisher that he had been told by Australian counterparts that the New Zealanders had betrayed the ANZAC spirit. The accusation deserves examination because the logic that produced it illuminates something fundamental about how military institutions process accountability. From the SASR's perspective, New Zealand soldiers had provided evidence to an investigation targeting an Australian operator, had broken the brotherhood compact that holds allied units together in the face of external scrutiny. From the NZ SAS perspective, their soldiers had described accurately to the proper investigative authority what they had personally witnessed. The accusation of betrayal rested entirely on which obligation was considered paramount: institutional loyalty to the ANZAC bond, or the professional standards that the bond, properly understood, had always demanded. The NZ SAS soldiers had made their choice. They were told it was the wrong one. When Australia and New Zealand both deployed special forces to Afghanistan following the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the NZ SAS joined Task Force K-Bar rather than operating alongside the SASR. The two forces conducted no joint operations in Afghanistan. The New Zealand Defence Force attributed this to separate task allocations. Fisher drew a different conclusion. New Zealand deployed without transport and without dedicated helicopter support, exactly the capabilities that partnership with the better resourced SASR would have provided. Pretty light on logistics, he observed, and exactly the sort of situation where you would turn to your ANZAC brother and say, "Why don't we work together?" East Timor was the last major combat mission in which the NZ SAS and the SASR fought as ANZAC partners. That record has not since been altered. The operational consequences of that separation were real and measurable. New Zealand's Afghanistan deployment, conducted without the logistical foundation that partnership would have provided, operated under constraints that a combined ANZAC force would not have faced. The NZ SAS performed creditably. Its soldiers operated effectively in some of the most demanding environments the war on terror produced, but they did so without the institutional backing and material support that the SASR, embedded within a larger and better resourced Australian deployment, could draw on. The separation cost both forces operationally and cost both nations strategically, in the diminishment of a combined capability that the ANZAC relationship had historically multiplied. That this diminishment traced directly to what had happened in East Timor, to the investigation, the trial, and the accusation of betrayal, has never been formally acknowledged by either defense establishment. The unofficial account, preserved in the testimony of those who were there, has instead been left to coexist with the official account of a separation explained by task allocation. The broader ANZAC spirit, forged at Gallipoli in 1915, carried through the Western Front, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam, was invoked in the aftermath of East Timor against the very soldiers who had upheld the professional accountability that the spirit, properly understood, had always demanded. The gap between those two versions of what the tradition required has never been officially addressed by either nation's defense establishment. During the years in which the two forces operated separately, something was developing within the SASR that a comprehensive inquiry, released on the 19th of November, 2020, would document with a thoroughness that left little room for institutional denial. The Brereton report, named for its author. New South Wales Supreme Court Judge and Army Reserve Major General Paul Brereton examined 55 incidents, interviewed more than 400 witnesses, and reviewed more than 20,000 documents and 25,000 images. Its findings constituted credible evidence of 39 murders of Afghan civilians and prisoners by members of Australian Special Forces between 2005 and 2016. The report documented practices that had acquired operational names within the culture that produced them. Blooding described the practice by which patrol commanders required junior soldiers to shoot captured prisoners. For their first kill, a deliberate ritual designed to bind individuals to the unit through shared complicity in acts that could not be reported upward without implicating those who had ordered them. Weapons were planted on bodies to create false evidence of hostile intent, producing documentation that would protect the operators involved and misrepresent for the official record what had actually occurred. The report concluded that criminal behavior had been conceived, committed, continued and concealed at patrol commander level, a finding that located the problem not in individual aberration, but in the organized culture of specific groups within the regiment, operating systematically across multiple deployments and multiple years. The Brereton report also documented the mechanisms by which that culture had been sustained. Junior soldiers who expressed discomfort were managed through social pressure, through the implicit and explicit threat of exclusion from the operational community they had invested years qualifying to join. The culture of silence that protected individual operators from accountability also protected the culture itself, each generation of patrol commanders transmitting the same expectations to the next, with sufficient institutional distance between deployments to obscure the systematic nature of what was occurring. The report described a regiment in which the formal command structure and the actual operational culture had diverged to the point where the formal structure could not see, or claimed not to see, what the operational culture was producing. Whether that divergence was a failure of oversight or a feature of an institutional arrangement that served some commander's interests is a question the report addressed carefully, and the subsequent criminal process is still working to resolve. The patterns the report described were not unprecedented in SASR history. They were unprecedented in the official record. The distinction between those two statements is where this story lives. Karl Failauer, speaking publicly for the first time about the East Timor investigation, was explicit about the chain he saw connecting the two episodes. A conviction in 2003 would have sent a different message through the SASR, that conduct outside its mandate carried consequences that institutional loyalty could not dissolve, and that allied witnesses would not stay silent about. The message actually delivered by the acquittal and the apology was, in Feilauer's assessment, the opposite. I believe honestly, as a result of that, it caused problems later in Afghanistan, he said. It gave the wrong message, that people could do what they want and get away with it. Military lawyers who spoke to Four Corners drew the same chain in institutional terms. The failure to prosecute in East Timor had encouraged a culture of impunity within the SASR that contributed directly to the conduct the Brereton report eventually documented. The pathway was cumulative rather than linear, each absence of consequence shaping the assumptions operators brought to the next deployment, the next patrol, the next decision about what the regiment would and would not hold its members to account for. Feilauer's connection between the two episodes was not speculative. It was the considered assessment of an investigator who had spent years inside both sets of events, who had interviewed the witnesses, reviewed the evidence, watched the prosecution collapse, and then lived to see the Brereton report document, in a different theater and a different decade, what the absence of accountability in East Timor had foreshadowed. His statement did not claim a direct causal line from Swai to Kandahar. It claimed something more defensible and more troubling, that institutions communicate to their members what the actual consequences of transgression are, and that the communication in 2003 had been unambiguous. The message was not encoded in any document or directive. It was delivered by the outcome itself, by the acquittal, by the apology, by the sealed records, by the meritorious unit citation that remained in place for a unit whose conduct had been the subject of a 2.5-year murder investigation. Those signals were legible to anyone within the SASR who was paying attention. The Brereton report documented what the reading of those signals, over the years that followed, had eventually produced. The Brereton report acknowledged allegations from previous conflicts, including Timor-Leste, but treated them as isolated incidents rather than as indicators of a systemic problem that had been building across decades. Whether that framing accurately represented the historical record, or whether it preserved the ADF's institutional self-image at the cost of a harder examination, is a question the report itself did not resolve. The command responsibility question followed the same contour across both conflicts. In East Timor, Cosgrove stated he had been unaware of any alleged impropriety when he declined to authorize an investigation on the 7th of October. In Afghanistan, the Brereton report found that commanders bore moral command responsibility while concluding they had not known the specific criminal conduct was occurring. The structural gap between what senior commanders claimed to know and what those below them were doing appeared, across 2 conflicts and 2 decades, to have remained consistently unaddressed and consistently unexplained. What the command responsibility question exposes, across both episodes, is the inadequacy of individual unawareness as an institutional explanation. In East Timor, the allegation was not that Cosgrove had ordered or condoned what happened on the 6th of October. The allegation, implicit in Andrina Gill's diary entry and explicit in the witness accounts, was that the structures designed to bring such conduct to command attention had failed, and that when one person within those structures attempted to trigger the investigation those structures were designed to produce, her request was declined. In Afghanistan, the Brereton report found a pattern of conduct that persisted across years and commanders. The finding of moral responsibility without knowledge was not an exoneration. It was a description of a system in which the formal hierarchy and the operational culture had separated to the point where the hierarchy could plausibly claim not to know what the culture was producing. That claim, plausible but troubling, has been the institutional defense in both cases. Its plausibility does not resolve the question of how that separation came to exist or who was responsible for allowing it to persist. For 22 years after the ambush, the sworn statements of New Zealand SAS soldiers sat in classified files. The court records from the 2003 proceedings remained under suppression orders. The story existed in the institutional memory of 3 nations' special forces communities, and nowhere else that mattered publicly. It did not appear in the official accounts of the Interfet mission. It did not feature in the citations that accompanied the meritorious unit citation awarded to 3 Squadron SASR in 2000 for their East Timor service. That citation remains in place. The gap between what it commemorated and what the sworn statements of Allied soldiers described is a gap a D. Citation does not acknowledge, and no subsequent official document has addressed. The Four Corners program Ghosts of Timor, broadcast on the 4th and 11th of April, 2022, changed what was publicly known. The 11 sworn statements of NZ SAS witnesses, never heard in court, never previously public, were broadcast for the first time. The AFP internal report became part of the public record. Andrina Gill's diary entry was read aloud. Gill and Failauer both spoke publicly for the first time. Their accounts carrying the authority of people who had been closest to the investigation's substance and who had waited more than 2 decades for the opportunity to describe it accurately. The response from the Australian defence establishment was limited. No new investigation was announced. No explanation was offered for why the torture charge briefs against the 3 intelligence officer commanders had never been acted upon. The court records from 2003 were not reopened. The meritorious unit citation was not reviewed. What the broadcast produced, most significantly, was a public record where none had existed before, a foundation from which further accountability could theoretically be constructed if the institutional will to construct it were ever present. The reaction among those who had been present in East Timor, on both sides of the national divide the events had created, was described by those who observed it as complex and in some cases painful. Some NZ SAS veterans who had given sworn statements years earlier experienced the broadcast as a partial vindication, the record they had committed to paper in official proceedings, and which had never reached a court, now existed in a form that the public could read and assess. Some SASR veterans reacted with the same institutional defensiveness that had characterized the post-SWI period. The same sense that what the New Zealanders had done by speaking was a transgression against the Brotherhood Compact rather than a fulfillment of professional obligation. The gap between those 2 readings of the same set of events, a gap that had opened in 1999 and had never been officially addressed, remained open in 2022, widened by 2 decades of silence rather than narrowed. David Fisher, the investigative journalist whose analysis of the long-term consequences has been the most thorough, produced by anyone working the story, offered a formulation that the subsequent decade validated. If you don't treat things like this in an open and honest way before the public, you get a rot that sets in. That rot that sets in can eat into an organization and cause damage that goes for years. That assessment was made before the Brereton report. It was not less accurate for having been made early. The rot Fisher described was documented precisely and at length in the findings of an inquiry that spent 4 years examining the absence of accountability in the years before it had been produced. East Timor in 1999 was, by any honest accounting, both Australia's proudest modern military achievement and a chapter that has never been fully told. The two truths are not in conflict. A mission can succeed at its stated strategic objectives, while the forces executing it contain individuals whose conduct violated the legal and moral framework that distinguished the mission from the atrocities it had been sent to stop. Interfet restored order. East Timor is an independent nation. Those facts are real, and the record of the mission that established them is genuine. What is also real is what the sworn statements of soldiers documented, what forensic pathologists found when they examined bodies 3 years after the ambush, and what a military police inquiry spent 2.5 years attempting to bring before a court, before a procedural ruling eliminated the only eyewitnesses and the case dissolved without a verdict. The questions those proceedings might have answered remain open. The black site and the torture allegations connected to it produced no charges, no convictions, and no official explanation. The fracture in the ANZAC Special Forces relationship, and the accusation that those who testified had betrayed the spirit that relationship embodied, has never been officially acknowledged by either nation's defense establishment. The soldiers who gave sworn statements describing what they witnessed have been told, by implication, and in some cases explicitly, that their testimony constituted a betrayal. That accusation has never been officially withdrawn. It sits alongside everything else that has been left unaddressed: the sealed records, the unexplained non-prosecutions, the citation that remains in place, as part of the architecture of official silence that the story of SWAI has inhabited for more than 2 decades. What the full record of SWAI demonstrates is a principle that applies beyond any individual operation or any single elite unit. When institutions protect their professional reputation ahead of their professional accountability, the protection does not contain the problem. It compounds it. It compounds across years and deployments and commands, accumulating in the culture of formations whose members understand, from the evidence before them, what the actual consequences of transgression are. Cultures do not sustain behaviors that the institution reliably punishes. They sustain behaviors the institution has demonstrated, through its responses and its silences, that it will absorb. The Brereton report, released more than 2 decades after the ambush, is the documentation of what had been absorbed. Its 39 documented murders did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a culture. And the question of where that culture began building, what the earliest moments were when accountability failed and the lesson was absorbed, is a question whose answer, in part, still sits in sealed files that have not been opened. If you found value in this history, consider sharing it with someone who should know it. The story of what happened on the road outside SWAI on the 6th of October, 1999, and in the debrief room afterward, and in the heliport facility in Dili, and in the classified files, and in the military courtroom where the only witnesses could not be called, deserves a wider audience than it has so far been given.